Have you ever looked into an animal's eyes and felt something deeper than the words could express? That inexplicable connection that bridges two different worlds? Today, I want to share with you the extraordinary story of Alistair and Cass, a tale that reminds us how the bonds we form with our animal companions can both break our hearts and ultimately save us. In the quiet hills of Vermont, a veterinarian running from his past found healing in the most unexpected way, through the trusting eyes of an abandoned dog. Their journey together would test the very limits of love, loyalty, and the courage to begin again when everything seems lost. Join me as we explore how one man's solitude was transformed by the silent understanding of a faithful friend, and how even in our darkest moments, the connection between humans and animals can light the path forward. This is The Silence Between Us, a story of grief, redemption, and the healing power of companionship. Where are you watching this video? Please share and follow the story below so we can spread this warmth to every corner. The silence of Alistair Finch's 10 acres wasn't merely an absence of noise. It was a meticulously constructed fortress against a world he no longer trusted, and against a past he couldn't outrun. 4 years now, a span measured less by calendars than by the slow accumulation of solitude. Since the sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic and the low, reassuring hum of anesthetic machines had defined the rhythm of his days. Here in the rolling foothills of Vermont, the dominant notes were the resinous tang of pine warming in the sun, the rich smell of damp earth after rain, the tang of wood smoke curling from his chimney on cool mornings, and the overwhelming, profound quiet. It was a quiet that had initially felt like a sanctuary after the relentless cacophony of his city clinic and the whispering aftermath of his failure. But it had long since become an echo chamber, amplifying the ghosts of memory and the steady, gnawing ache of unresolved grief. The landscape itself, with its stoic beauty, the fierce, almost blinding greens of summer surrendering to the burnished golds and crimsons of autumn, then the deep, muffling white blanket of winter yielding to the hesitant, muddy thaw of spring, seemed less a comfort than a vast, indifferent witness to his exile. It demanded a resilience Alistair felt he possessed only as a kind of stubborn, passive endurance. He endured the isolation, endured the flickering reel of memories, endured the slow, unyielding passage of time, marked by the shifting patterns of light across the worn floorboards and the deepening lines etched around his eyes like contours on a map of sorrow. He'd fled north after Leo, the 6-month-old golden retriever, a clumsy embodiment of pure, trusting joy. "Just a routine neuter, Mrs. Gable. Simple procedure. He'll be right as rain by tomorrow." The words, spoken with the easy, practiced confidence of thousands of successful surgeries, now felt like shards of glass in his memory. Malignant hyperthermia, a lightning strike from a clear sky, a rare genetic betrayal triggered by the very agents meant to ensure painless procedure. He remembered the sudden, terrifying spike on the monitor, the feel of Leo's muscles seizing beneath his hands, the frantic, desperate ballet of emergency protocols. Ice packs, dantrolene, CPR, all useless against the runaway metabolic firestorm. And then the chilling silence, the flat line, the irrefutable finality. Worse even was Mrs. Gable's face, not angry, not accusatory, just utterly devastated, her eyes reflecting a bewildered incomprehension that somehow indicted him more profoundly than any lawsuit could have. He had failed not just medically, but cosmically. He had broken a sacred trust, selling the practice, severing ties, ignoring the bewildered concern of colleagues. It had been less a reasoned decision than a panicked flight, an instinctual burrowing away from the light of scrutiny, from the burden of explanation, from the constant, unbearable reminders of his fallibility. He'd driven north without a clear destination, simply needing distance, anonymity, until this remote property found online, offered the promise of seclusion bordering on oblivion. 10 acres of trees, a barely habitable house, miles from anywhere that mattered. It was enough. Or perhaps it was precisely not enough, a fitting purgatory. It wasn't just the failures that haunted him, though. Success, too, could leave scars. He remembered a case years earlier, a valuable show dog, a Doberman named Baron, suffering from gastric torsion, a twisted stomach, rapidly fatal without immediate, complex surgery. The owners were frantic, wealthy, demanding. The surgery itself was fraught, a high-wire act against the clock. Alistair had performed flawlessly, skillfully untwisting the stomach, securing it, managing the anesthesia perfectly despite the dog's compromised state. Baron survived, recovered, went on to win more titles. The owners were effusive in their praise, generous in their payment. Yet Alistair remembered the gnawing unease afterward. He'd felt less like a healer, more like a high-priced mechanic fixing a valuable piece of biological machinery. The intense pressure, the focus on the dog's monetary value rather than its intrinsic worth, the owner's subtle implication that failure was simply unacceptable. It had left a bad taste, a feeling of being complicit in a system that sometimes prioritized status over genuine connection. That, too, had chipped away at the passion that had first drawn him to veterinary medicine. He hadn't just fled failure, he'd fled the complex, often uncomfortable realities of the profession itself. Here, the only demands were the changing seasons and the needs of one quiet companion, Cass. He'd found the dog nearly 3 years ago now, a shivering scrap huddled by the roadside in the teeth of a late November wind. Abandoned, injured, expecting nothing. Briared mix, Alistair still guessed, though his lineage was irrelevant. What mattered was the slow, tentative way the half-grown dog, initially wary and expecting rejection, had uncurled himself into Alistair's solitary life. He hadn't demanded affection or attention. He had simply offered presence, a warm, breathing weight against the cold emptiness. He learned Alistair's routines, anticipated his moods, communicated in a silent language of tilted ears, soft sighs, and unwavering gazes. Cass became the anchor, the steady heartbeat syncing with the rhythms of the woods, the furry guardian of Alistair's fragile truce with the world. Their bond, forged in shared solitude and unspoken understanding, was the single thread connecting Alistair to the possibility of simple, uncomplicated affection. But lately that bedrock felt subtly unstable. Watching Cass doze on the sun-warmed porch now, Alistair couldn't shake the accumulated unease of the past few weeks. The brief disorientation on the ridge walk, Cass stopping, looking around with a lost expression before shaking his head and moving on. The slight stumble, a momentary hind leg weakness, climbing the porch steps last week. The head shaking by the woodpile that very morning. That fleeting instant where Cass's eyes seemed vacant, unfocused, before he trotted over as if nothing had happened. Individually, minor incidents, chalked up to age, a stray scent, a patch of ice. But collectively, the veterinarian in him, however dormant, saw a potential pattern, a constellation of subtle neurological signs he desperately wanted to ignore. "Don't borrow trouble," he told himself fiercely. "He's fine." He pulled on his sturdy hiking boots, the familiar ritual usually signaling the afternoon walk, eliciting an eager response from Cass. Today, Cass merely lifted his head, his dark eyes watching Alistair, his tail giving a single, slow thump against the weathered porch boards, before he rested his chin back on his paws with a soft sigh. The lack of enthusiasm felt like another small, cold stone added to the growing weight in Alistair's gut. "Come on, boy," Alistair said, forcing cheerfulness, clipping the worn leather leash onto Cass's collar. Cass submitted quietly, rising with a stiffness that seemed more pronounced than usual. Maybe he just needs to stretch his legs. They stepped out into the cool, crisp April air, the scent of pine and thawing earth, sharp and clean. They started along their habitual path near the property line, Cass padding beside him, perhaps staying closer than usual, his shoulder occasionally brushing Alistair's thigh. Alistair tried to focus on the familiar sights and sounds, the chittering of a red squirrel in the branches overhead, the pattern of lichen on an old stone wall, the distant cry of a hawk circling above the ridge. But his attention kept snagging on Cass's slightly altered gait, the way he held his head at a barely perceptible, unusual angle. He noted fresh, small footprints near the northern boundary again. Lily Miller. He really needed to speak to George about her wandering. As they approached the cluster of derelict outbuildings near the western edge, the collapsed shed, the leaning privy, the crumbling stone foundation nearly swallowed by weeds, Cass stopped dead in his tracks. Not the interested pause of investigation, but a sudden, rigid immobility. His body locked, muscles bunched hard as stone beneath Alistair's hand, head lowered, fur bristling along his spine. A low guttural growl rumbled up from deep within his chest, a sound utterly alien, rougher, more menacing than anything Alistair had ever heard from him. It wasn't directed at the ruins, but seemed aimed at the empty air itself. "Easy, boy," Alistair murmured, tightening his grip on the leash, scanning the shadows. "What is it? Something in the shed?" Cass ignored him completely. The growl intensified, punctuated by a high, distressed whine. He began shaking his head violently, back and forth, staggering sideways as if struck, his paws scrabbling for purchase on the uneven ground. He blinked rapidly, pupils blown wide, dark and terrifyingly empty in the flat afternoon light. "Cass?" Alistair knelt quickly beside him, fear gripping him, cold and sharp. "What is it? What's wrong with you?" Cass let out a sharp, choked yelp, stumbling again. He turned his head towards Alistair, and in that instant, the world tilted on its axis. The familiar warmth, the intelligence, the years of shared understanding in those dark eyes vanished, replaced by a terrifying blankness, a flat, unseeing void that reflected only Alistair's own horrified face. It was like looking at a stranger wearing his dog's skin. Then came the snarl, ripped from deep within, ragged, vicious, devoid of warning or reason. Lips peeled back, gums exposed, teeth bared in a horrifying grimace of pure, unthinking aggression. Before Alistair's mind could fully process the shocking metamorphosis, before he could react, Cass lunged, not at the ruins, not towards any discernible threat, but blindly, violently, with terrifying speed, at the empty air where Alistair's hand had rested on his shoulder only moments before. Alistair threw himself backward, scrambling on the damp, leaf-littered ground, loose stones digging painfully into his palms. His breath hitched, trapped in his throat. Adrenaline surged, a brutal cocktail of fear and disbelief. The image of Cass's bared teeth, the shocking emptiness in those eyes, it replayed behind his eyelids, stark and terrifying. One moment, his steady companion. The next, this creature consumed by a violent, unknowable storm. The air itself seemed to crackle with the raw sound erupting from the dog's throat, a continuous, ragged snarl that bore no resemblance to any sound Cass had ever made before. "Cass!" Alistair tried again, his voice a thin shred of sound, instantly swallowed by the dog's terrifying vocalizations. Cass didn't respond, didn't falter. He continued shaking his head violently, as if trying to dislodge an unbearable pain or pressure inside his skull. He staggered again, his movements jerky, uncoordinated, his powerful body seemingly disconnected from any rational control. He paced in a tight, frantic circle, bumping into a rotted fence post without apparent awareness. His breathing was harsh, shallow, interspersed with choked gasps. The desperate respiration of an organism in profound physiological crisis. His vacant eyes swept the surroundings, but didn't seem to focus or register Alistair or the familiar landscape. There was no conscious thought behind the aggression, only raw, misfiring neurological impulses generating fear, agony, and terrifying, undirected violence. He's suffering immensely, Alistair realized, the clinical diagnosis overridden for a moment by a wave of helpless, horrified empathy. He's trapped inside this nightmare. Then, with the same terrifying abruptness as the lunge, Cass bolted. He spun, disoriented, and crashed blindly into the dense wall of hemlock and tangled ferns bordering the clearing, moving with a frantic, explosive burst of energy utterly unlike his usual measured pace. Branches snapped. Dry leaves flew in his wake. He wasn't fleeing Alistair. He seemed propelled by the internal chaos, a runaway engine of scrambled instinct careening through the undergrowth. "Cass! Stop! Come back!" Alistair surged to his feet, shock momentarily eclipsed by the instinct to pursue, to intervene, to somehow help. He plunged into the dense woods after him, ducking under low-hanging branches, pushing through resistant laurel thickets, his heart hammering against his ribs like a frantic drum. Panic tightened its icy grip around his chest. What is happening? Stroke? Tumor? Acute poisoning? The differential diagnoses, the stock and trade of his former profession, scrolled through his mind, each possibility more devastating than the last, all pointing towards a catastrophic neurological event and the terrifying potential for unpredictable danger. He could hear Cass thrashing violently through the brush just ahead, the sounds terrifyingly erratic. Crashing noises, followed by high-pitched yelps of pain, then sudden, sharp bursts of guttural growling. Alistair pushed himself harder, desperation lending strength to his limbs, his boots sliding on slick patches of moss covering unseen rocks, his lungs burning from the exertion and the raw, cold air. The familiar woods, usually his sanctuary, felt suddenly alien, menacing, the trees seeming to press closer, the shadows deepening with sinister intent. He had to reach him. He had to see. He shoved through a final, dense screen of mountain laurel, scratching his face and hands on the stiff, unforgiving leaves, and stumbled abruptly into a smaller, hidden clearing he rarely visited. This one held the melancholy, crumbling fieldstone foundation of an old hunting cabin, long since surrendered to the relentless encroachment of the forest. He stopped dead, his breath catching in his throat, the scene before him crystallizing into a tableau of pure horror, turning the blood in his veins to ice water. Cass stood near the center of the small clearing, his body rigid as iron, trembling uncontrollably from head to tail, his head lowered as if weighted down. The snarls were continuous now, a horrifying, unbroken sound that seemed to reverberate off the ancient stones. Spittle flew from his muzzle as he paced stiffly, and pinned against the far wall of the foundation, trapped in a crumbling corner where two low stone walls met, was Lily Miller. Her small face was a mask of absolute frozen terror, bleached white under a smudge of dirt. Her eyes stretched impossibly wide, reflecting the snarling shape before her like dark, terrified mirrors. Her bright pink jacket, a shocking splash of artificial color against the muted greens and grays of the decaying stones and encroaching twilight, only served to emphasize her terrifying vulnerability. She was making herself as small, as insignificant as possible, pressing back hard against the cold, moss-slicked stones. Her small hands splayed flat against the rock face as if seeking to merge with it, to disappear. She was utterly silent, not even crying, locked in the primal paralysis of mortal fear. Only the faintest, almost imperceptible hitching of her small chest indicating that she was still breathing. Cass wasn't merely cornering her, he was actively, terrifyingly stalking her within the confined space. He took short, stiff-legged steps back and forth, never taking his eyes off the child, his attention absolutely, pathologically fixed. Each pass brought him fractionally, inexorably closer. The low, continuous growl vibrated with undeniable lethal intent. He was coiled like a spring, a powerful predator held in check only momentarily by the confusing, painful signals firing erratically within his own brain. But clearly gathering himself, muscles bunched, preparing for the final, inevitable lunge. Alistair's mind fractured, operating on two simultaneous conflicting tracks. One part, the man who loved Cass, the man whose lonely existence revolved around this dog, recoiled in horror and disbelief. Number not Cass. It can't be him. Something's wrong, temporary, I can fix it, I have to fix it. But the other part, the veterinarian, the trained diagnostician, assessed the horrifying scene with brutal, instantaneous, clinical clarity. Severe neurological signs, opisthotonus likely developing, probable hyperthermia, extreme agitation, unprovoked hyperaggression directed at non-threatening target, complete lack of response to owner stimuli. This wasn't a behavioral issue. This wasn't rabies in its typical presentation. This was almost certainly a catastrophic, acute neurological event. A massive seizure, a stroke, a rapidly expanding brain tumor reaching critical mass. Prognosis, here in the woods, miles from any facility, 0, irreversible, and the immediate unavoidable consequence, hanging by the thinnest of threads, was the life of the terrified child trapped only feet away. His mind desperately grasped at straws, at impossible alternatives, only to discard them instantly. Restraint? Utterly impossible. Cass, strong and powerful even when healthy, was now fueled by pathological aggression and adrenaline. Attempting to physically intervene alone would be suicidal and would almost certainly trigger an immediate, fatal attack on Lily or himself. Sedation? He had nothing. Even if he had a fully stocked veterinary bag right there, chemical restraint in this hyper-agitated state was dangerously unpredictable and far too slow. Wait for help? He glanced desperately at the sky, confirming the rapidly fading light. Maybe an hour until full dark. No cell signal this deep in the woods. Even if he could sprint back to the house, use the ancient landline, call 911, 15 minutes minimum? Then how long for a rural sheriff's deputy to navigate the back roads, find the property, locate the clearing? 30 minutes? 45? An hour or more? He looked at Lily, saw the fine, uncontrollable tremor shaking her small body, heard the rising pitch and intensity of Cass's snarls as the dog took another stiff, deliberate step closer. They didn't have an hour. They didn't have 10 minutes. They might not have 60 seconds. The situation was degrading with terrifying speed. "Cass, no! Sit! Stay!" Alistair shouted, his voice cracking, falling back on the most basic commands, the ones ingrained through years of repetition, hoping against hope for some tiny spark of the old Cass, some flicker of residual training to penetrate the neurological storm. Cass's head snapped toward the sound, the movement sharp, unnatural. For one fleeting, agonizing microsecond, Alistair's heart leaped. Was that a pause? A flicker of confusion? Recognition? But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, consumed instantly by the underlying pathology. The sound, the command, seemed only to heighten his agitation, to overload his already scrambled senses. He lowered his head again, emitting a terrifying, high-pitched yelp intertwined with a vicious snarl, and took another definitive, menacing step towards Lily, his powerful body gathering itself, muscles bunching for the final, fatal lunge. It was undeniable. There was no reaching him. The Cass he knew and loved, the gentle giant, the quiet companion, was gone, irretrievably lost inside the biological nightmare consuming him. What remained was a vessel of profound suffering and pure, undirected, lethal danger, and its focus was absolute. A cold, sickening certainty washed over Alistair. extinguishing the last embers of desperate hope, crystallizing into a terrible, unavoidable clarity in the pit of his stomach. He saw Leo's pale, still form on the cold steel of the operating table. He felt again the crushing weight of that failure, the vow he'd made to himself never to fail like that again. He saw Lily's small, terrified face, her absolute helplessness against the impending violence. The equation was grotesque, unthinkable, a violation of every instinct he possessed as a healer, as a caregiver, as Cass's devoted companion. But it was inescapable. Cass was already lost. Saving Lily meant doing the unthinkable, acting against instinct. He had to get the shotgun. The thought alone was a physical blow, making him gag, bile rising in his throat. But there was no other path left, no other intervention possible in the terrifyingly short time remaining. He had to leave the clearing, leave Lily exposed and undefended for the few critical minutes it would take him to retrieve the weapon. It was a horrifying gamble, predicated on Cass's broken focus remaining fixed, predicated on Alistair's speed and resolve, predicated on sheer desperate luck. "Lily," Alistair said again, pitching his voice low and steady, forcing a calm he was nowhere near feeling, praying she could hear him over the snarling. "Lily, listen to me very carefully. I need you to be the bravest girl in the world for just a few minutes. Stay right there. Don't move. Keep your eyes closed tight or look right down at your feet. Don't watch him. Can you do that for me? I have to go get something from the house. I will be right back, I promise you. Just be very still." Her eyes, impossibly wide, dark pools of terror in her white face, met his briefly across the clearing. She gave the tiniest possible nod, a barely perceptible up and down movement of her chin, before squeezing her eyes tightly shut again. Her small hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. Her lips moved silently, perhaps whispering the count he'd suggested, perhaps praying. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that felt like inhaling broken glass, Alistair met Cass's unseeing, pain-filled eyes one last, agonizing time. A silent scream of apology, of grief, of helpless, heartbroken farewell tore through the deepest part of his soul. "Forgive me, boy. Forgive me." Then he turned his back on the horrifying scene and forced himself to run. He ran away from the clearing, away from the snarling, away from the terrified child, back towards the house, towards the terrible instrument that represented the only remaining horrifying solution. The run was a frantic, stumbling nightmare through the darkening woods. Every root seemed placed to trip him, every low branch positioned to snag his clothes and impede his progress. The distance back to the house, usually a contemplative 10-minute walk through familiar territory, felt impossibly long, stretched taut by terror and adrenaline. What if Cass heard him leave? What if the dog's fractured attention shifted? What if he turned back towards the clearing only to hear a child's scream cut short? The horrific images spurred him onward, panic lending a desperate, clumsy speed to his flight. He burst through the back door, nearly wrenching it off its hinges, stumbling onto the familiar linoleum of the kitchen floor. The relative normality of the room, the ticking clock, the neat stack of mail on the counter, a coffee mug left unwashed in the sink, felt jarringly, sickeningly alien compared to the primal horror unfolding just minutes away in the woods. He lunged for the gun cabinet, bolted to the wall in the pantry, fumbling with the small key on his keychain, his fingers numb and clumsy with adrenaline and dread. He wrenched the cabinet door open and pulled out the heavy 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, its familiar checkered grip and cold steel barrel feeling alien, obscene, impossibly heavy in his trembling hands. He fumbled with the box of shells on the top shelf, rifled slugs designed for bringing down deer at 50 yards. Overkill, perhaps, but brutally effective. His hands shook violently as he slotted 2 heavy brass shells into the magazine tube, the metallic clicks loud, final. He worked the pump action decisively, chambering the first round. The solid shuck clack of the mechanism echoed like a judge's gavel in the quiet kitchen, sealing his terrible resolve. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the door frame for a single, shuddering moment, trying desperately to draw a steady breath, trying to push back the wave of nausea and despair threatening to engulf him. Healer, protector, his life's calling, the core of his identity, now twisted into this grotesque act of destruction. He was about to point this weapon, this instrument of finality, at the creature who had been his only solace, his most loyal and unwavering friend, the silent witness to his exile. It felt like preparing to sever his own limb, a violation so profound it felt like a part of his own soul was already dying. But Lily's terrified face, small and white against the unforgiving stones, flashed before his eyes again. Cass's agonized snarls echoed in his ears, the sound not of aggression, but of unbearable suffering. There was no other choice. There was only the grim, horrifying, unavoidable necessity. He pushed himself away from the doorframe, his jaw set, gripping the shotgun with a steadiness that surprised him, born not of courage but of sheer, desperate resolve. He moved back outside into the rapidly fading twilight that painted the woods in shades of gray and deep purple. He forced himself into a controlled, almost stealthy movement now, melting back into the trees, heading towards the clearing, moving like a hunter stalking his prey. But he felt no thrill of the chase, only the crushing weight of impending loss, the cold dread of the executioner. He prayed desperately, fervently, that he wasn't already too late, that the fragile, terrifying stalemate in the clearing still held. The low, continuous growling reached him first as he neared the clearing, confirming his worst immediate fears hadn't yet materialized, but signaling that the situation remained critically volatile. If anything, the sound seemed more agitated, higher pitched now. He reached the edge of the clearing, sinking automatically into a crouch behind the familiar, dense screen of young birch trees, their pale bark almost luminous, ghostly in the deepening gloom. He peered cautiously through the latticework of leaves and branches. The scene was agonizingly unchanged, yet vibrating with an almost palpable increase in tension. Lily was still pressed rigidly against the wall, eyes squeezed shut, perhaps whispering her count, perhaps praying, a tiny statue of pure terror carved against the ancient stones. Cass was closer now, terrifyingly closer, only 6 or 7 feet separating him from the child. He paced his tight, frantic, stiff-legged pattern back and forth before her, head low, body quivering uncontrollably, foam dripping from his muzzle onto the dark, damp leaves below. The breaking point felt imminent, seconds away. Any sudden movement, any unexpected sound, Alistair knew with chilling certainty, could trigger the final, fatal lunge. Alistair raised the shotgun smoothly, the muscle memory of countless hours spent target shooting years ago taking over, a skill he now wished he'd never acquired. He settled the smooth wooden stock firmly against his shoulder, the cold metal a shocking contrast to the heat flushing his face. He sighted down the long, blued steel barrel, his world narrowing, tunneling, his breathing shallow and fast despite his efforts to control it. His focus absolute narrowed to a single, horrifying point. The brass bead sight at the end of the barrel hovered, then settled deliberately just behind Cass's shoulder. The vital zone, the spot calculated by grim necessity for the quickest, most certain, most humane end. Humane! The word was a bitter, terrible mockery in his mind. His finger found the cold curve of the trigger. Time seemed to stop, stretching into an unbearable, silent eternity. Images flooded his mind in a dizzying, heartbreaking, chaotic cascade. Cass as a muddy, shivering stray, blinking up at him from the roadside with wary hope. Cass curled asleep by the hearth fire on a snowy night, dreaming, paws twitching. Cass resting his heavy head on Alistair's knee during a thunderstorm, seeking comfort. Cass nudging his hand gently just that morning, before the storm broke, his eyes full of warmth and unwavering, unconditional trust. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, boy." He took one final, ragged, shuddering breath, held it, concentrating with an intensity born of desperation, forcing the tremor from his hands, forcing the terrible resolve. The woods seemed utterly silent now, holding their breath with him, waiting for the inevitable violation. The world compressed into the space between Alistair's eye and the bead sight at the end of the shotgun barrel, the front bead sight and the patch of wheat-colored fur just behind Cass's shoulder where the heart lay. Time warped, stretching agonizingly thin, each heartbeat echoing like a drum beat in the profound stillness. He saw the fine tremor running continuously through Cass's rigid flank, the uncontrolled quivering of muscles clenched against an inner agony Alistair could only imagine. He saw the terrifyingly absolute stillness of the child, Lily pressed against the cold stones as if willing herself to dissolve into them, a fragile beacon of innocence caught in the path of a biological storm. He saw the ghost of Leo, the golden pup, lifeless on the sterile steel table, a past failure he could never undo. He felt the crushing weight of the responsibility he had tried to flee, now returned with horrifying immediacy. There was no choice left, only the brutal, unavoidable necessity. His finger, steady now with a chilling, detached resolve that felt utterly alien, squeezed the trigger. The explosion ripped through the twilight stillness, obscene, deafening, a violent violation of the wood's peace. It slammed back through the gunstock into Alistair's shoulder with bruising force, a physical punctuation mark to an act of profound emotional violence. The sound echoed, a rolling wave of sound crashing against the trees, momentarily silencing every bird call, every rustle of life, leaving only a high-pitched, painful ringing in Alistair's own ears. Acrid smoke, smelling sharp and metallic, puffed from the barrel, stinging his nostrils. Through the sight, momentarily blurred by the recoil and the sudden, involuntary watering of his eyes, he saw Cass jolt violently, as if struck by an invisible colossal blow. The aggressive tension, the terrifying rigidity, vanished in an instant, replaced by a sudden, shocking, complete slackness. The ragged snarl cut off mid-sound. The dog crumpled, collapsing onto the thick carpet of damp leaves and pine needles without a sound, his legs folding beneath him in a way that spoke of utter, irreversible finality. The chaotic energy that had animated him moments before was extinguished like a snuffed flame. There was only stillness, an absolute, profound stillness that screamed louder in the sudden silence than the gunshot itself. A stillness that felt heavier, colder, more absolute than any sound could ever be. Alistair didn't lower the gun immediately. He couldn't seem to make his arms obey the command from his brain. He stood frozen behind the protective screen of birch trees, the heavy weapon suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds, an anchor dragging him down into an abyss of shock and horror. The ringing in his ears slowly began to subside, replaced by the frantic, suffocating roar of his own blood pounding in his temples. Nausea surged again, hot and bitter, churning violently in the pit of his stomach. I did it. The thought wasn't just a thought. It was a physical blow, stealing his breath, making his knees threaten to buckle. Oh God, Cass. I killed Cass. Slowly, mechanically forcing movement through the thick paralysis of shock, he lowered the shotgun. He broke it open, the action smooth despite the tremor in his hands, ejecting the spent shell. The brass casing gleamed momentarily against the dark moss before he deliberately looked away, unable to bear the sight of the small, potent object. He carefully removed the second, unfired shell, his fingers feeling thick and clumsy. He leaned the now safe weapon against the pale trunk of a birch, needing distance, needing desperately to not be touching the instrument that had delivered the terrible, necessary solution. His hands were shaking violently now, uncontrollably, the adrenaline draining away rapidly, leaving behind a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. A small sound, barely audible, fragile as a moth's wing, broke the spell. A choked sob, quickly stifled, from the direction of the stone wall. Lily. He forced his legs to move, stumbling slightly as he stepped out from behind the concealing trees. His steps felt leaden, each footfall heavy, dragging him across the small clearing towards the scene of the tragedy. His eyes were drawn first, irresistibly, to Cass. He lay utterly still, a mound of familiar, beloved fur that looked tragically small and vulnerable against the vast indifference of the woods. The fading twilight softened the harshness of the scene, but couldn't disguise the unnatural angle of his limbs, the finality of his stillness. Alistair approached hesitantly, stopping a few feet away. He could see the subtle signs more clearly now, the slight discoloration around the muzzle from the earlier foaming, the way the muscles still seemed subtly clenched even in death, testament to the violence of the neurological storm that had raged within him. He knelt beside his companion, his hand hovering inches above the thick, soft fur, wanting desperately to touch him one last time, to feel the familiar warmth, to offer some final, futile comfort, but physically unable to bridge the terrible gulf created by the gunshot. Gone. The word was a hollow, aching echo in the cavern where his heart used to be. Is he sleeping now? Lily's voice, thin as spider silk, fragile with shock and dawning comprehension, pulled him back from the abyss of his own grief. Alistair rose slowly, turning to face her. She had lowered her hands from her face and was staring, not at Cass anymore, but directly at Alistair, her eyes enormous pools of shock, confusion, and a dawning, terrible understanding in her pale, dirt-streaked face. He moved closer, sinking into a crouch again, keeping his movements deliberately slow, non-threatening, acutely aware of the violence he represented in that moment. The man who had just wielded the loud, terrifying weapon. "No, Lily," he said, his voice thick, raw, scraping his throat. He had to make her understand, had to frame the horror in words that might offer some solace, some justification, both for her and for himself. He wasn't just angry, he was very, very sick inside his head. It happened very fast, like a wire broke inside, and it made him confused, and it hurt him terribly. He didn't know what he was doing. He wouldn't have wanted to scare you like that. He searched desperately for the right words. What happened just now? The loud noise. It stopped the hurting for him. It was the only way to make the hurting stop. And it was the only way I could keep you safe. She watched him, absorbing his words with the unnerving seriousness of a child confronting an adult tragedy far beyond her comprehension. She sniffled, wiping her nose on the sleeve of her dusty pink jacket. She shivered, a delayed reaction to the penetrating chill of the evening air and the lingering effects of profound shock. "You were very loud," she whispered, her gaze flicking nervously towards a still form on the ground. "Yes," Alistair acknowledged, his own ears still ringing faintly with the memory of the blast. "Yes, I was. I'm very sorry it scared you more." He extended a hand slowly, palm up. "Are you hurt anywhere? Did you fall down when he was growling at you?" She shook her head, a small, jerky movement, her eyes still fixed on his face. After a moment's hesitation, her small, ice-cold fingers slipped into his outstretched hand. The contact was startling, electric, a fragile current of life against the overwhelming presence of death. He held her hand gently, firmly, feeling the slight tremor running through her small body. "Okay," he said softly, trying to project a reassurance he was far from feeling. "Let's get you back to the house now. Your grandma and grandpa will be very worried. Let's go." He helped her carefully to her feet, her legs still unsteady, almost buckling beneath her. He put a steadying arm around her small shoulders and guided her away from the foundation, consciously taking a path that led them away from the clearing without passing Cass's body again. He didn't look back. He couldn't bear it. He focused entirely on the small hand held tightly in his, on the uneven ground beneath their feet, on navigating the darkening woods, on putting one foot mechanically in front of the other. The weight of her small hand felt immense, a responsibility heavier and more profound than the shotgun he'd left leaning against the birch tree. He'd retrieve it later, much later, when the world felt slightly less tilted on its axis. The walk back to the house through the deepening twilight seemed to take an eternity. Lily stumbled frequently, her coordination compromised by shock, and Alistair had to steady her constantly, sometimes lifting her bodily over larger roots or moss-covered rocks. The woods, usually his sanctuary, felt deeply menacing now, the familiar shapes of trees twisting into monstrous, accusing silhouettes in the gloom. Every rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig underfoot, seemed to echo the gunshot, seemed to whisper judgment in the whispering breeze. He felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped bare by the violence he had both witnessed and enacted. Reaching the faint yellow light spilling from his kitchen window felt like reaching a port after navigating a treacherous storm. But the familiar interior of the house, the worn linoleum floor, the ticking regulator clock on the wall, the faint scent of coffee still lingering from that morning, felt alien, jarringly normal, completely disconnected from the primal horror he'd just experienced. He settled Lily carefully into the sturdy oak chair at the kitchen table, retrieving the old, colorful, crocheted afghan from the back of the sofa and tucking it gently, carefully around her small, shivering shoulders. She sank into its comforting warmth, looking impossibly small and lost in the oversized chair. He poured her a glass of water from the tap, noting with a strange sense of detachment that his own hand was remarkably steady now, functioning on some deeply ingrained autopilot learned through years of medical emergencies. Then came the phone call. Standing by the old-fashioned rotary phone mounted on the kitchen wall, the heavy black receiver felt unnaturally cold and dense in his hand. He dialed the Miller's number from memory, the clicks and whirs of the dialing mechanism gratingly loud, intrusive in the tense silence of the room. Martha answered on the third ring, her voice radiating a warm, oblivious normalcy that felt like it belonged to another universe entirely. He felt the crushing weight of the responsibility he had tried to flee, now returned with horrifying immediacy. There was no choice left, only the brutal, unavoidable necessity. His finger, steady now with a chilling, detached resolve that felt utterly alien, squeezed the trigger. The explosion ripped through the twilight stillness, obscene, deafening, a violent violation of the wood's peace. It slammed back through the gun stock into Alistair's shoulder with bruising force, a physical punctuation mark to an act of profound emotional violence. The sound echoed, a rolling wave of sound crashing against the trees, momentarily silencing every bird call, every rustle of life, leaving only a high-pitched, painful ringing in Alistair's own ears. Acrid smoke, smelling sharp and metallic, puffed from the barrel, stinging his nostrils. Through the sight, momentarily blurred by the recoil and the sudden, involuntary watering of his eyes, he saw Cass jolt violently, as if struck by an invisible, colossal blow. The aggressive tension, the terrifying rigidity, vanished in an instant, replaced by a sudden, shocking, complete slackness. The ragged snarl cut off mid-sound. The dog crumpled, collapsing onto the thick carpet of damp leaves and pine needles without a sound, his legs folding beneath him in a way that spoke of utter, irreversible finality. The chaotic energy that had animated him moments before was extinguished like a snuffed flame. There was only stillness, an absolute, profound stillness that screamed louder in the sudden silence than the gunshot itself. A stillness that felt heavier, colder, more absolute than any sound could ever be. Alistair didn't lower the gun immediately. He couldn't seem to make his arms obey the command from his brain. He stood frozen behind the protective screen of birch trees, the heavy weapon suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds, an anchor dragging him down into an abyss of shock and horror. The ringing in his ears slowly began to subside, replaced by the frantic, suffocating roar of his own blood pounding in his temples. Nausea surged again, hot and bitter, churning violently in the pit of his stomach. I did it. The thought wasn't just a thought, it was a physical blow, stealing his breath, making his knees threaten to buckle. Oh God, Cass, I killed Cass. Slowly, mechanically, forcing movement through the thick paralysis of shock, he lowered the shotgun. He broke it open, the action smooth despite the tremor in his hands, ejecting the spent shell. The brass casing gleamed momentarily against the dark moss before he deliberately looked away, unable to bear the sight of the small, potent object. He carefully removed the second unfired shell, his fingers feeling thick and clumsy. He leaned the now safe weapon against the pale trunk of a birch, needing distance, needing desperately to not be touching the instrument that had delivered the terrible necessary solution. His hands were shaking violently now, uncontrollably, the adrenaline draining away rapidly, leaving behind a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. A small sound, barely audible, fragile as a moth's wing, broke the spell. A choked sob, quickly stifled from the direction of the stone wall. Lily. He forced his legs to move, stumbling slightly as he stepped out from behind the concealing trees. His steps felt leaden, each footfall heavy, dragging him across the small clearing toward the scene of the tragedy. His eyes were drawn first irresistibly to Cass. He lay utterly still, a mound of familiar, beloved fur that looked tragically small and vulnerable against the vast indifference of the woods. The fading twilight softened the harshness of the scene, but couldn't disguise the unnatural angle of his limbs, the finality of his stillness. Alistair approached hesitantly, stopping a few feet away. He could see the subtle signs more clearly now, the slight discoloration around the muzzle from the earlier foaming, the way the muscles still seemed subtly clenched even in death, testament to the violence of the neurological storm that had raged within him. He knelt beside his companion, his hand hovering inches above the thick, soft fur, wanting desperately to touch him one last time, to feel the familiar warmth, to offer some final, futile comfort, but physically unable to bridge the terrible gulf created by the gunshot. Gone. The word was a hollow, aching echo in the cavern where his heart used to be. Is he sleeping now? Lily's voice, thin as spider silk, fragile with shock and dawning comprehension, pulled him back from the abyss of his own grief. Alistair rose slowly, turning to face her. She had lowered her hands from her face and was staring, not at Cass anymore, but directly at Alistair, her eyes enormous pools of shock, confusion, and a dawning, terrible understanding in her pale, dirt-streaked face. He moved closer, sinking into a crouch again, keeping his movements deliberately slow, non-threatening, acutely aware of the violence he represented in that moment. The man who had just wielded the loud, terrifying weapon. "No, Lily," he said, his voice thick, raw, scraping his throat. He had to make her understand, had to frame the horror in words that might offer some solace, some justification, both for her and for himself. He wasn't just angry, he was very, very sick inside his head. It happened very fast, like a wire broke inside, and it made him confused, and it hurt him terribly. He didn't know what he was doing. He wouldn't have wanted to scare you like that. He searched desperately for the right words. What happened just now? The loud noise. It stopped the hurting for him. It was the only way to make the hurting stop, and it was the only way I could keep you safe. She watched him, absorbing his words with the unnerving seriousness of a child confronting an adult tragedy far beyond her comprehension. She sniffled. wiping her nose on the sleeve of her dusty pink jacket. She shivered, a delayed reaction to the penetrating chill of the evening air and the lingering effects of profound shock. "You were very loud," she whispered, her gaze flicking nervously toward the still form on the ground. "Yes," Alistair acknowledged, his own ears still ringing faintly with the memory of the blast. "Yes, I was. I'm very sorry it scared you more." He extended a hand slowly, palm up. "Are you hurt anywhere? Did you fall down when he was growling at you?" She shook her head, a small jerky movement, her eyes still fixed on his face. After a moment's hesitation, her small, ice-cold fingers slipped into his outstretched hand. The contact was startling, electric, a fragile current of life against the overwhelming presence of death. He held her hand gently, firmly, feeling the slight tremor running through her small body. "Okay," he said softly, trying to project a reassurance he was far from feeling. "Let's get you back to the house now. Your grandma and grandpa will be very worried. Let's go." He helped her carefully to her feet, her legs still unsteady, almost buckling beneath her. He put a steadying arm around her small shoulders and guided her away from the foundation, consciously taking a path that led them away from the clearing without passing Cass's body again. He didn't look back. He couldn't bear it. He focused entirely on the small hand held tightly in his, on the uneven ground beneath their feet, on navigating the darkening woods, on putting one foot mechanically in front of the other. The weight of her small hand felt immense, a responsibility heavier and more profound than the shotgun he'd left leaning against the birch tree. He'd retrieve it later, much later, when the world felt slightly less tilted on its axis. The walk back to the house through the deepening twilight seemed to take an eternity. Lily stumbled frequently, her coordination compromised by shock, and Alistair had to steady her constantly, sometimes lifting her bodily over larger roots or moss-covered rocks. The woods, usually his sanctuary, felt deeply menacing now, the familiar shapes of trees twisting into monstrous, accusing silhouettes in the gloom. Every rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig underfoot, seemed to echo the gunshot, seemed to whisper judgment in the whispering breeze. He felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped bare by the violence he had both witnessed and enacted. Reaching the faint yellow light spilling from his kitchen window felt like reaching a port after navigating a treacherous storm, but the familiar interior of the house, the worn linoleum floor, the ticking regulator clock on the wall, the faint scent of coffee still lingering from that morning, felt alien, jarringly normal, completely disconnected from the primal horror he'd just experienced. He settled Lily carefully into the sturdy oak chair at the kitchen table, retrieving the old, colorful, crocheted afghan from the back of the sofa and tucking it gently, carefully around her small, shivering shoulders. She sank into its comforting warmth, looking impossibly small and lost in the oversized chair. He poured her a glass of water from the tap, noting with a strange sense of detachment that his own hand was remarkably steady now, functioning on some deeply ingrained autopilot learned through years of medical emergencies. Then came the phone call. Standing by the old-fashioned rotary phone mounted on the kitchen wall, the heavy black receiver felt unnaturally cold and dense in his hand. He dialed the Miller's number from memory, the clicks and whirs of the dialing mechanism gratingly loud, intrusive in the tense silence of the room. Martha answered on the third ring, her voice radiating a warm, oblivious normalcy that felt like it belonged to another universe entirely. "Alistair? Everything all right over there?" Getting dark out. His throat closed up. He had to swallow hard, force the words out past the constriction. "Martha, it's Alistair. Listen, I have Lily here, at my house." "Lily? Oh, thank the good Lord. We've been worried sick, frantic. George is out combing the woods right now. Is she all right? Did she just get lost exploring again? What happened?" Her relief quickly cascaded into a torrent of anxious questions. He took a shallow, ragged breath. She's physically unharmed, Martha. Shaken, terrified, but not physically hurt. He paused, gathering himself to deliver the rest. But something happened out here. Something bad. He relayed the horrifying story again, his voice flat, clinical, almost robotic. A defense mechanism kicking in, shielding him from the raw emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He recounted finding her trapped by the old foundation, Cass's sudden, inexplicable transformation, the clear signs of a catastrophic neurological event, the uncontrolled aggression, the lack of recognition, the assessment of immediate lethal danger, the horrifying lack of alternatives. He heard Martha's sharp intakes of breath through the receiver, punctuated by small choke sounds. "Oh dear God, Alistair," she finally gasped, her voice sharp with fear. "Did he bite her? Did that dog bite my granddaughter?" No, absolutely not," Alistair reassured her quickly, emphatically. "She's physically fine. But Martha..." He hesitated, the next words tasting like ash. "You and George need to come immediately. And, Martha, I think you need to call the sheriff's department." A heavy, loaded pause hung on the line, stretching for several long seconds, filled only with the sound of Martha's quick, shallow breathing. "The sheriff?" she finally whispered, the warmth completely gone from her voice, replaced by a chilling dread, a dawning comprehension. "Alistair, why? What about Cass? Your dog? Oh, heavens, what? What did you have to do?" He closed his eyes tightly, leaning his forehead against the cool plaster wall, the image of Cass falling, the awful, final stillness, searing itself behind his eyelids. "Cass cornered her, Martha," he said, the words heavy as lead, each one costing him dearly. "He was going to attack. There was no choice. There was no time left. I had to stop him." He paused, the next words tearing at his throat. "He's gone, Martha. Cass is gone." Another silence descended, longer this time, broken only by a sound that might have been a stifled sob from Martha's end. "Oh, Alistair," she breathed at last, her voice thick with shock, horror, and an unexpected, profound pity that felt almost unbearable to him. "That gentle soul. Oh, you poor, poor man. What a terrible thing. George just pulled in the drive. We'll call the sheriff right now. We're on our way. 5 minutes, maybe less." He murmured a choked thank you and hung up the phone, the click of the receiver echoing like a final punctuation mark in the crushing silence. He slid slowly down the wall until he was sitting heavily on the cold linoleum floor, his back pressed hard against the plaster, knees drawn up tightly to his chest. He buried his face in his hands, scrubbing at his eyes, but no tears came. Only a vast, echoing emptiness, a profound sense of violation and irreversible loss. Lily watched him from the table, her wide, solemn eyes reflecting the dim overhead light, her earlier terror replaced by a child's unnerving, watchful stillness. He looked up at her, this small human whose life was intact because his beloved companion's life was over. The terrible, brutal calculus of the situation settled over him, cold and sharp and undeniable. The house, his supposed sanctuary, felt suddenly like a fragile stage set, unreal, holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable arrival of flashing lights, uniforms, questions, judgment. The long, agonizing night of consequences just beginning its slow, inexorable unfolding. He had saved her undoubtedly, but in doing so he felt utterly, devastatingly damned. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the frantic ticking of the old clock on the wall, marking time in a world that felt irrevocably broken. He waited, bracing himself, adrift in the immediate shattering aftermath. The twin beams of headlights sweeping across the kitchen window were almost a relief, breaking the tense, suffocating silence that had descended after the phone call. The familiar rumble of the Miller's old pickup truck, sounding overly loud in the still night air, crunched to a halt on the gravel driveway. Doors flew open before the engine even died. George and Martha rushed towards the house, their faces illuminated briefly in the truck's headlights, stark masks of frantic worry that softened instantly, collapsing into overwhelming relief the moment they saw Lily, huddled but physically whole, in the kitchen chair. "Oh, Lilybug, my baby girl!" Martha cried, bypassing Alistair completely as if he were invisible and rushing to Lily, gathering her granddaughter into a fierce, trembling hug that spoke volumes of protective, primal love. Lily clung to her grandmother, burying her face in the familiar, comforting bulk of her sweater, the dam finally breaking as she sobbed out her terror and relief in racking gasps. George Miller, his face grim, but his eyes holding a deep, compassionate understanding that transcended words, came straight to Alistair. He didn't offer facile comforts or ask immediate, intrusive questions. He simply put a heavy, calloused hand on Alistair's shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity, of shared humanity in the face of horror that anchored Alistair more than any spoken reassurance could have. "Thank God," George breathed, his voice gruff with emotion, his grip tightening briefly. "Thank God she's all right, Alistair. That's all that matters." Minutes later, the pulsing, disorienting flashes of official blue and red lights painted the surrounding trees in unsettling, strobing colors as Deputy Miller's marked cruiser pulled in quietly behind the pickup truck. The deputy, young but carrying himself with an air of calm competence that seemed slightly incongruous in this remote, emotion-charged setting, stepped out and approached the house deliberately. He took in the scene, the distraught grandparents comforting the weeping child, Alistair standing pale, numb and hollow-eyed by the door, with a neutral, professional gaze. Introductions were made again, brief and strained in the cold night air. Deputy Miller spoke gently and respectfully to Lily first, kneeling down to her level, asking simple, direct questions about what she saw, what the dog did, how she felt. He listened patiently as her story tumbled out again, fragmented by sobs but consistent, corroborated by Martha's tearful additions. Then he turned his attention to Alistair. Alistair recounted the horrific events for what felt like the 100th time, his voice low, monotonous, deliberately stripped of emotion, sticking rigidly to the observable facts, the sequence of events, his clinical assessment of Cass's condition, the perceived immediate lethal threat, the lack of viable alternatives, the final terrible action. He felt strangely dissociated, as if reporting on a particularly grim case study from his former life. The walk back to the clearing was a somber procession guided by the powerful beams of official flashlights, cutting sharp cones of white light through the oppressive darkness. The air felt colder here, heavier, imbued with the lingering psychic residue of the violence that had occurred. Alistair pointed out the key locations, where Lily had been trapped against the crumbling foundation, where he had stood behind the birch trees, where Cass lay still beneath an old blanket Alistair had retrieved from the house before the deputy arrived. Deputy Miller conducted his examination of the scene methodically, photographing everything, measuring distances with a rolling tape, carefully bagging the ejected shell casing Alistair indicated, making detailed notes in a small, waterproof notebook. He paid particularly close attention to Cass's body, observing the physical signs Alistair had pointed out, the posture suggesting neurological rigidity even in death, the dried foam around the muzzle, the lack of any external wounds inconsistent with a simple attack. He asked Alistair more specific, probing questions about Cass's behavior leading up to the event, the exact nature of the aggression, the dog's response, or lack thereof, to commands. "Your assessment of an acute, severe neurological event seems highly consistent with the presentation, Doctor." "Finch," the deputy commented quietly, rising from his examination of Cass. His use of the title again felt deliberate, an acknowledgement of Alistair's relevant expertise. We see some strange things out here sometimes. Atypical rabies presentations, poisonings from carelessly discarded toxins, even brain tumors, though rare. The state lab results will be definitive, of course. He shone his light briefly on the surrounding woods. But given the clear and immediate danger to the child, your professional assessment, the documented lack of timely alternatives in this remote location, based on my initial investigation, your actions appear to fall within the scope of justifiable use of force under state statutes regarding the defense of a person from death or serious bodily injury. The formal language, the objective assessment framing the horror within legal necessity, didn't erase the grief or the trauma, but it did provide a fragile bulwark against the crushing weight of self-condemnation. It wasn't absolution, but it was official understanding, a recognition of the impossible calculus he'd faced. Back at the house, while the Millers prepared to take a now exhausted and drowsy Lily home, Deputy Miller took Alistair's formal, written statement. He carefully documented the details of the shotgun Alistair retrieved from its cabinet, confirming its legal ownership and that it had been secured appropriately beforehand. He explained the next steps clearly. Animal Control would be notified to retrieve the body in the morning for transport to the state veterinary lab for necropsy. The report would likely take 1 to 2 weeks. He treated Alistair not as a suspect requiring interrogation, but as a traumatized participant in and witness to a tragic, unavoidable event. He offered the victim's support contact card again before leaving. "This was a hard thing, Doctor." "Finch," he said with quiet sincerity, "worst kind of call to respond to. Don't hesitate to use these resources if you need them." Finally, the Millers were ready to leave, bundling a sleeping Lily, still wrapped securely in Alistair's grandmother's Afghan, into the warm cab of their truck. George paused again at Alistair's door, his weathered face etched with a complex mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "We owe you everything, Alistair," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't you ever carry doubt about doing the right thing by our Lily. And I mean it. Anything you need. Fence needs mending, wood needs splitting, just need to sit and not talk. You call us. We'll be here." Then they were gone. The red taillights of their pickup truck receded down the dark, winding driveway, leaving Alistair utterly alone in the house, the silence crashing back in, heavier, more profound, more absolute than any silence he had ever experienced before. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the ordeal drained away completely, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness, an aching physical and emotional exhaustion so profound it felt like illness. He locked the door, the simple click of the deadbolt echoing like a cell door closing in the stillness. He looked around the familiar kitchen, his gaze drifting over the mundane objects, each now seeming imbued with a terrible significance. Cass's empty water bowl by the back door, the indentation on the worn braided rug by the cold wood stove where he always slept, the leash still hanging on its hook, waiting for a walk that would never happen again. Each object was a fresh stab of grief, a tangible reminder of the vibrant life extinguished, the companionship irrevocably lost. Sleep was impossible that night, and for many nights that followed. He would drift into an exhausted stupor, only to be jolted awake by fragmented nightmares, flashes of bared teeth, Lily's terrified eyes, the deafening roar of the shotgun, the awful final stillness of Cass's body on the forest floor. He wandered the small house like a ghost during the long, dark hours, the silence amplifying the relentless churn of his thoughts. He replayed the events endlessly, examining each decision, each split-second assessment, searching for an alternative he might have missed, a different path he could have taken, even while knowing, with chilling certainty, that there had been none. The next morning brought the quiet, professional efficiency of the county animal control officer. Alistair watched, numb, from the kitchen window as the officer respectfully loaded Cass's blanket-wrapped body into the designated compartment in the truck. Watching the truck drive away, carrying the physical remains of his best friend, felt like a final, brutal severing. He spent the rest of the day in a fog of grief, unable to focus, unable to settle, the house feeling unnaturally large, unnervingly empty. In the following days, he tried to establish some semblance of routine, forcing himself to eat, to shower, to perform the basic chores required to maintain the property. But everything felt muted, pointless. The woods walks felt empty without Cass trotting beside him. The quiet evenings by the fire felt lonely, charged with absence. He found himself talking to Cass sometimes, murmuring apologies to the empty air, recounting memories aloud as if to keep them tangible, alive. One gray afternoon, driven by a morbid need for closure or perhaps self-punishment, he gathered Cass's few belongings: the worn leather leash, the cracked ceramic water bowl, the collection of favorite well-chewed rubber toys, the grooming brush still tangled with strands of familiar, wheat-colored fur. He sat on the floor, holding each object, letting the memories associated with them wash over him. Cass as a clumsy pup, tripping over the leash on their first walk. Cass joyfully crunching his kibble from that bowl. Cass proudly presenting a slobbery toy for a game of fetch. The feel of the soft fur under the brush during their quiet evening grooming sessions. Each memory was a bittersweet pang, love and loss inextricably intertwined. He couldn't bring himself to throw them away, not yet. He carefully packed them into a sturdy cardboard box and stored it away in the back of the closet, postponing the finality. Weeks crawled by. The vibrant greens of summer slowly gave way to the first hints of autumn color on the distant hillsides. Alistair existed in a kind of limbo, functioning but not truly living. The Millers were quietly persistent in their support, respecting his need for space, but refusing to let him disappear entirely. Martha frequently left covered dishes on his porch, hearty stews, fresh-baked bread, jars of preserves, often with a brief, kindly note attached. George stopped by occasionally, ostensibly to check on the fence line they shared, but clearly also just checking on Alistair himself, offering gruff but genuine conversation about the weather, the price of hay, the struggles of dairy farming. One blustery afternoon in September, George appeared at his door again, looking hesitant. "Alistair, hate to impose. Remember those sheep I was telling you about? The respiratory thing? Well, that supplement helps some, but now Ginny, my best ewe, she's really laboring. Coughing something fierce. Vet's tied up with calving season way over in Rutland County. I know it's asking a lot." Alistair found himself nodding before George even finished. He followed George back to the Miller farm, the familiar sights and sounds of a working farm, both jarring and strangely comforting. He examined Ginny carefully, his hands moving with a gentle confidence he hadn't realized he still possessed. Auscultating her lungs, he heard the telltale crackles of advanced pneumonia. This required more than supplements. He explained the diagnosis to George, outlined a course of injectable antibiotics, demonstrated the proper technique. Visiting the farm daily for the next week to check on Ginny, administer the shots, and monitor her progress felt purposeful. It was demanding, requiring focus and skill, pulling him momentarily out of the mire of his own grief. Seeing the ewe slowly recover under his care sparked a faint, long-dormant ember of professional satisfaction. Martha always insisted he stay for coffee afterward, sitting at her warm, bustling kitchen table. Lily was often there, doing homework. She rarely spoke directly about the bad day, she called it, but her interactions with Alistair became less wary, more curious. One afternoon, she showed him a school project about local wildlife, asking him questions about the animal tracks he saw in the woods near his house. Answering her simple, direct questions felt surprisingly natural. A fragile bridge of normalcy was slowly being built over the chasm of trauma. The official confirmation from the state lab arrived by mail almost 2 months after the incident. A formal letter detailing the necropsy findings, a large, aggressively malignant glioma originating near the brainstem, consistent with sudden onset neurological failure, extreme pain, and unpredictable aggression. Prognosis, 0. The clinical, dispassionate language on the page was a stark, final validation of the horrifying necessity of his actions. He folded the letter carefully and put it away. It didn't lessen the grief, but it settled the last lingering vestiges of doubt, quieting the insidious internal whispers that questioned his judgment in those frantic, terrifying moments. Autumn deepened, the hillsides blazing with fiery color under a sky that seemed impossibly blue and clear. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the earthy decay of fallen leaves. Alistair found a measure of solace in the hard physical work of preparing for winter, splitting and stacking firewood, reinforcing the storm windows on the old house, clearing brush from the property lines. The rhythmic labor tired his body and quieted his mind, offering temporary respite from the relentless cycle of grief and memory. One cool, bright afternoon in late October, Sarah Jenkins' brown delivery truck rumbled up the drive. Alistair, taking a break from stacking wood, walked out to meet her. She handed him a package, the latest issue of a wildlife photography magazine he'd subscribed to on a whim months ago. She lingered for a moment, her observant gaze taking in the significantly larger woodpile compared to previous years, the neatened appearance of the yard, the subtle changes in Alistair himself, less haunted perhaps, more grounded. "Looks like you're laying in a good supply for winter," she observed, nodding toward the woodpile. "Trying to," Alistair replied, finding the small talk less strained than it had been months ago. Sarah leaned against her truck, crossing her arms. "Heard from Martha Miller you helped save their prize ewe," she said, her tone casual but her eyes holding a hint of warmth. "Good thing you were around. Not many folks left out this way, no animals like that anymore." She paused, then seemed to make a decision, her expression turning more serious. "Lost my own husband 8 years back," she said quietly, her gaze drifting toward the distant hills. "Cancer, fast and mean. Not the same thing as losing a pet. I know some folks think that. But," she looked back at Alistair, her eyes holding a depth of understanding that transcended the specifics. "Loss is loss, leaves a hole you can't ever really fill. Found keeping my hands busy was the only thing that helped to get through the first couple years. Chopping wood, fixing things on the old place. Couldn't fix the main thing, the hole inside, but working on the edges seemed to help keep me from falling all the way in, you know?" She gave a small, wry shrug. "Town talk gets things wrong half the time, gets folks judging what they don't understand. But sometimes you just gotta do the hard thing that's put in front of you. Don't mean it don't leave a mark." She met his eyes directly then, a brief, powerful moment of unexpected, unvarnished human connection, forged in the shared territory of grief and resilience. "You take care of yourself out here, Mr. Finch." She gave a brief nod, climbed back into her truck, and drove away, leaving Alistair standing there, the package forgotten in his hand, strangely moved by the unexpected offering of empathy from this pragmatic, observant woman who navigated the lonely back roads of their shared corner of the world. Winter arrived eventually, blanketing the landscape in deep, insulating snow, muffling the world in a profound quiet. But this winter, the silence felt different to Alistair, less like the echoing emptiness of a prison cell, more like a quiet, contemplative space, conducive to slow healing. He spent the long, dark evenings reading by the crackling wood stove, sometimes even delving into the veterinary journals again, engaging with the familiar language of his past profession, not with dread, but with a renewed, albeit cautious interest. He thought often of Cass, the sharp stab of grief now softened into a persistent, dull ache, a phantom limb pain that reminded him of what he'd lost. But increasingly, the painful memories were interleaved with moments of warmth, humor, and profound gratitude for the years of unwavering companionship they had shared. Spring eventually returned, unlocking the landscape from winter's grip. Ice melted, creeks swelled, the first tentative buds appeared on the trees, painting the gray woods in hopeful shades of tender green. The air grew milder, alive with the cheerful cacophony of birdsong, carrying the rich scent of damp earth in the promise of renewal. Alistair stood one cool, bright April morning by the flat fieldstone marker near the edge of the woods, a full year having passed since that terrible, life-altering day. He placed a hand on the stone, its surface warmed slightly by the strengthening sun. The scar on his soul remained, a permanent part of his internal landscape, a testament to the trauma, the loss, the impossible choice. But beneath it, around it, something new and fragile had taken root and was slowly, tentatively growing. Acceptance. Acceptance of the tragedy, acceptance of the necessity, acceptance of the enduring power of the bond with Cass that transcended even its violent, heartbreaking end. Acceptance, too, of his own fractured, healing self. He turned from the quiet grave, leaving the silent sentinel behind him, and walked back towards the small house, smoke curling lazily from his chimney, a thin ribbon against the vast, indifferent blue sky. He saw George Miller out in the distant pasture, checking on his herd, and raised a hand in greeting. George waved back heartily. He heard the faint, cheerful sound of Lily's laughter, carrying on the gentle breeze from the Miller farm. The fortress of his isolation hadn't crumbled, but the heavy gates were no longer bolted from within. The silence was still his companion, but it was a different kind of silence now. Less an exile, more a chosen quietude, holding echoes of the past, acceptance of the present, and the quiet, fragile, unexpected possibility of a future. He carried the scars, visible and invisible, but he was standing, and here in the quiet heart of the Vermont woods, surrounded by the resilient beauty of the natural world, Alistair Finch was slowly, painstakingly, finding his way forward, one season, one breath, one day at a time.